My name is Megan Radecki, and it's my pleasure to serve as your director here at the Hauenstein Center for Presidential Studies. And I want to thank you all for joining us today on March 14, Pi Day, for those of you who celebrate. I'm sorry we won't be sending you home with a pie as a parting gift, but I'm sure there are many local bakeries who'd be happy to supply that for you. We are thrilled to have you join us for a really interesting talk today. We have author and public historian Brooke Barbier, who's with us to talk to us about the life of John Hancock. And I have to tell you, as we have gotten closer to this day, I have become more and more intrigued with the topic, primarily because of her premise that she talks about that he was a moderate founding father during a radical time. And I think many of us, if you're paying any attention to the news, right, we see some interesting things going on where individuals sort of on the edges of some of our parties or our ideologies or whatever you want to call it are often controlling a lot of the narrative. And there's a lot of space in the middle where a lot of the people that I talk to and know think some of their beliefs and ideas fit, but those aren't often represented because that's not often what moves the needle. That's not how the legislation is getting put together. And so I think it's really interesting and very apropos that we talk about what it looked like for John Hancock to be a moderate during radical times and how he was able to be effective and ultimately, become one of our founding fathers. So really excited about this talk, excited to talk to you afterwards to see what you take away from it. But I think it's going to be a great one for us to enjoy and discuss together. We are here tonight because of a very special individual, Ralph Hauenstein, and it is his birthday next week. Ralph would have been 111 this year, and we think of him fondly. We were very fortunate to have him for 103 years, but we've been without him for 8. We still remember him fondly in our hearts. It is his life of legacy and service that inspires what we do, and ultimately it's why we set about every day to pursue our mission of raising a community of ethical, effective leaders for the 21st century. So I want to thank you all for being here, to our members and our students and our community members. Thanks for helping us live that mission out together. Thanks for helping us make good on what Ralph really inspired us all to be and to do. And again, next Wednesday, if you think about it, take a minute, think about Ralph. Think about a way that you might show up in the world in a meaningful way that he would be proud of on that day. One thing that Ralph was most passionate about was our Peter C. Cook Leadership Academy. Many of you are familiar with the public programming that we do like tonight, but we also have a leadership academy with Grand Valley students from undergrads all the way to graduate students. We have about 70 students in the cohort right now, representing 47 different majors. And together they are on a leadership journey where they take time to reflect about what it means to be a leader, what are the critical skills that one must have, and again, how do you as a leader show up in the world and what kind of positive difference can you make? One of our leaders, our Cook Leadership Fellows, is with us tonight to share her leadership minute, and I'm so excited to introduce her. Let me tell you a little bit about Haley Dimstra. Haley is a 5th-year student here at GVSU. Over the next year, she'll be finishing her degree in Integrated Science Elementary Education with a minor in elementary mathematics. Yay, a teacher. We know how important those are. After graduation, she hopes to pursue a career as a STEM teacher and become a leader in creating STEM curriculum. Haley has a passion for STEM education, student well-being, and teacher appreciation. And as a first-year fellow candidate, she hopes to gain important leadership skills and connections that she can use as a future teacher and educational leader. Outside of Grand Valley, Haley works as a lead instructor tutoring K-12 students, where she helps students feel more comfortable in their abilities and rebuilds their confidence in themselves so they can be successful in the classroom. Friends and colleagues, join me in welcoming Haley.
Thank you, Megan, for that introduction. Good evening. As Megan said, my name is Haley Dimstra, and I am a Peter C. Cook Leadership Academy Fellow candidate. This semester, I spend my time in a classroom filled with 9-year-olds. Just a few hours ago, I taught my 3rd graders a lesson from their unit covering Michigan's journey to statehood during social studies. For those of you who are not familiar with what goes on in our classrooms, each subject has to be taught in a certain amount of time throughout the week. In the average public school, 3rd graders spend 9.9 hours learning language arts, 5.8 hours in math, 2.9 hours in science, and only 2.8 hours in social studies. In our education system, we rank the subjects our students learn based on how important we feel they are. Therefore, we put a limit on the amount of learning our students obtain in the school day. The education that students receive is supposed to prepare them for a life as citizens in our society. With these time constraints, we're depriving our students of the education that allows them to be inspired and curious about the world they exist in. As a future educator, I know my job as a leader is to prepare my students to be citizens in our society. But I want my students to leave my classroom feeling empowered to make a difference, learning about individuals from our past who had a mission for making a change, like John Hancock, directly impacts how empowered students feel to follow in the footsteps of individuals like this. I hope that someday we can come to a compromise that allows students to dive deeper into their interests and curiosities in the classroom, so that when they enter society, they are citizens ready to make a difference. As we leave this event today, I challenge us all to take our learning and pass it along to the next generation of students, so that they realize that there is more to our history than the sliver they learned during social studies. My name is Haley Dimstra, and I am a leader. Thank you. I am now pleased to introduce our speaker for this evening. Brooke Barbier is a public historian and author who received her PhD in American history from Boston College, specifically researching Boston's social and cultural life during and after the American Revolution. While earning her graduate degree, she taught at Boston College and Stonehill College. Please join me in welcoming Brooke to the stage.
Thank you, Haley and Megan and Brent, and for all of you for coming out this evening. I'm so delighted that I get to talk to you all today about John Hancock. Would it surprise you to learn that the Declaration of Independence and U.S. Constitution were disputed by our nation's founders? Because they are two of the most important documents to our nation's history and cherished today, it may be difficult to imagine them being anything other than enthusiastically accepted by the founding generation. This is a natural perspective because we live in the United States today that is still governed by the Constitution. And we know that the colonists had success in fighting against the British Empire and in early nation building. Psychologists identify a tendency called hindsight bias, wherein people see past events as predictable or logical, and outcomes are seen to be more likely to have occurred than they actually were. With this thinking, other alternatives or perspectives are dismissed or deemed irrelevant to the final outcome. When evaluating history, and especially a revolution, it is easy to succumb to hindsight bias and believe that everything happened exactly the way that it should have and that it happened easily. But this ignores the reality of 18th century life and that the very real discussions, debates, and divisions among the people in the colonies at the time. Tonight, let's put aside our natural hindsight bias as we look at John Hancock's influence on the American Revolution. Let's watch as he navigates a time of turmoil. We associate John Hancock with his bold signature on the Declaration of Independence. But he was a moderate in a time and place of radicals. His adopted hometown of Boston in the 1760s and 70s was the epicenter of mobbing, violent protests, and tarring and feathering. Yet Hancock was able to avoid such extremes. He remained popular with the masses, all while effecting political change, despite being slow to adopt some of these resistance efforts. I'm going to talk about how it was his moderation that benefited two different phases of the American Revolution: the very radical resistance and rebellion of the 1760s and 70s, and then in the creation of the new nation. First, let's get a brief background on the man John Hancock. When he was 7, his life fundamentally changed because his dad died, and he went to live with his wealthy paternal uncle in Boston. His Uncle Thomas was a self-made man who in his lifetime amassed one of the largest fortunes in Massachusetts. He did this as a merchant. When Hancock was 27, Uncle Thomas died, and the significant holdings of Uncle Thomas got passed down to John Hancock. His uncle's death in 1764 coincides with a big moment in the colony. This was the year that Parliament, Great Britain's governing body, decided to pass their first tax that begins that familiar timeline of no taxation without representation. In 1764, they passed the Sugar Act. The following year, they passed the Stamp Act. Boston led the way in violently opposing the Stamp Act, and it was eventually repealed a year later. And Boston and Hancock went back to resuming normal affairs. Hancock eagerly got back to doing business with London, despite these two taxes. That is, until another tax was passed in 1767, called the Townshend duties, which imposed a duty on imported British goods, things like clothing, paper, tea. This is going to drastically affect Hancock's business because he's now going to have to pay more to import and sell such goods. To enforce these taxes, Parliament also set up a new customs board in Boston to try to reduce smuggling. If the tax was bad, these customs officials were worse. They earnestly patrolled Boston Harbor, eager to stop and search any vessel. They despised Bostonians for what they perceived to be their very permissive attitude toward smuggling. And there would be no bigger reward to catch than the wealthy and popular John Hancock, a man who learned from his uncle that smuggling was acceptable. Customs officials were going to target Hancock, and we'll see how his moderation sharply contrasts with the violent reaction from Boston's townspeople. Here's what happens. In the spring of 1768, there were two tidesmen called Owen Richards and Robert Jackson. A tidesman, we're going to use that term a couple of times here. So it is a man who would patrol the wharves and board ships to collect taxes. So there's these two tidesmen, Owen Richards and Robert Jackson, who are determined to catch Hancock smuggling. And they board his wharf in Boston Harbor. This is a map of Boston in 1769, and while I do not recommend it, you could use it today to get around parts of downtown Boston. Many of the streets have the same names and same layout. Not everyone was wealthy enough to have their own wharf, but Hancock certainly was, and you can see it here. So Richards and Jackson board Hancock's ship. Hancock gets word that they're below deck, and he arrives and tells them both to come up above. When he asks Richards what business Richards had on board, Richards replied that he was simply performing his duty as a customs officer. Hancock said, "You are not to go below deck. You know that. You are allowed to stay above deck." Then Hancock turned to his crew and said that anyone who let Richards below deck or anybody else that shouldn't be there would be fired. Richards and Jackson left Hancock's wharf, but they did not give up. Just the following day, they returned to Hancock's wharf, went on board one of Hancock's ship, and were snooping around. Hancock gets word that they're there, and he arrives with some of his men. Richards is still below deck, and Hancock demands that he come above deck. Richards refuses, so Hancock sends some of his men down below deck to grab Richards and pull him above deck. The men dump Richards in front of Hancock, and Hancock publicly berates Richards, telling him he had no right to go below deck. A crowd is gathering in Boston at this time because they're so excited that someone is standing up to these hated customs officials. And they wanted to huzzah for Hancock and escort him home that night. Hancock's very public, swaggering display made him popular with the Bostonians, but it put a target on his back with powerful people. By the way, Richards is going to continue to annoy Bostonians. He's not going to come up again tonight, but it's worth telling you that a couple of years after this incident, Richards was tarred and feathered in Boston while 2,000 people looked on. In a rare twist, the mob set fire to the feathers so the skin underneath would burn. Richards would survive. So, Hancock now has this target on his back, and a ship of his arrives from Madeira. Madeira is an island off the African coast, and it's filled with Madeira. Madeira is a fortified wine that was a favorite of Hancock's. Here's another view of the harbor. This one comes from 1768, done by Paul Revere, who did this engraving here. So Hancock's ship Liberty docks at Hancock's Wharf. The name of that ship is going to become ironic in a minute. Thomas Kirk was the tidesman that day, and Hancock declares that he has 25 casks of Madeira on board. Kirk accepts this number, Hancock pays his taxes on it, and they go their separate ways. Except Liberty could hold more than double that capacity. And customs officials were suspicious that Hancock didn't declare everything that had been on his ship. So they questioned Thomas Kirk. And Kirk says, no, everything was on the level. Customs commissioners remained suspicious, and they got a burst of good luck when Kirk came forward a month later and totally changed his story. He said, do you remember when I said everything was on the level? Well, I said that, and I was lying. And I was lying because I was afraid. And I was afraid because John Hancock's captain, John Marshall, is really scary. But John Marshall had recently died. And so Kirk said, now I feel comfortable coming forward to tell the true account of what happened that day. Kirk spins quite a tale. He says that on the day that Liberty docked, Captain John Marshall asked Kirk to look the other way while they illegally unloaded goods. Kirk said that when he refused, some of Marshall's men grabbed Kirk, pulled him below deck, where they locked him in a cabin and nailed the top down. For 3 hours, Kirk could hear the noise of the tackles and the hoisting out of goods, and then the noise stopped. The door to the cabin opens, John Marshall fills the doorway and tells Kirk that if he breathes a word about what he saw or heard that night, he and his property would be harmed. This story is the work of an imaginative mind, but it does what it needs. It implicates Hancock. So 2 customs commissioners go down to Hancock's Wharf, ready to seize Liberty. Little else but the hint of wrongdoing by customs commissioners would draw a crowd in Boston at this time, but especially in defense of the most popular man in town, John Hancock. So a crowd gathers round and tells those 2 customs commissioners that they shall not seize Hancock's ship unless they want to be chucked into the harbor. They were resolute. They seized Liberty, branded the mast with the King's mark, and hauled Liberty and secured it to a British warship in the middle of Boston Harbor. The townspeople erupted. They hit these 2 customs commissioners with clubs and brickbats. The son of one of the customs commissioners was also overrun. He was dragged by the hair through the streets while people threw dirt on him and hit him with sticks. All of that's a lot. But then the mob takes it one step further. They drag a sailboat built by one of those customs commissioners out of Boston Harbor. They haul it through the streets of Boston with loud huzzahing along the way, and they dump it on Boston Common, the public park. The Hancock mansion sat at the top. There, they set the boat on fire. It was a stunning display to defend Hancock's right to smuggle wine. Despite this, Hancock is not nearly as troubled by the politics of it all. He just had a violent mob defend him, but Hancock wants to cut a deal with the crown. He makes money as a merchant, and as long as the British customs officials are holding on to liberty, he can make no money. So he makes a deal and says that he will stand trial for smuggling if they give liberty back. His politics were not radical enough to stop trading with London forever. This tax, the townshend duties, did not stop him from wanting to do business with them and cutting a deal. However, radicals in Boston, like Samuel Adams and James Otis, were furious when they heard about Hancock's deal. They arrived to his mansion that night and told him that he can't go through with it, that it is giving too much oxygen to British policies. With no commercial interests, Adams and Otis had far less at stake and less to lose than a man like Hancock. This is a theme that's going to come back up, specifically with Samuel Adams. He is a man with less at stake, and so he is more radical. Throughout the night, other Bostonians also stopped by Hancock's mansion. One account said, quote, his house was full. Here's his house there. The visitors explained that Hancock could not legitimize Crown policies by arranging the deal. With mounting pressure, Hancock reneged on his arrangement. Notably, Hancock's first instinct had been to bargain with the British, not attack or stonewall them. He sought practicality when living under British rule. But when faced with mounting pressure from radical Bostonians, Hancock backtracked. He would have to protest the way Adams and Otis wanted to for now. Things got even more violent in Boston shortly after the Liberty Riot because the Crown decides to send in British troops to occupy and police Boston. Violence broke out in March 1770. British soldiers stationed in Boston shot into an unruly crowd and killed 5 people. What became known as the Boston Massacre, this is a depiction by Paul Revere of the massacre. What became known as the Boston Massacre was a turning point for Hancock and the town, but not in the way you might think. The town wasn't more activated after the massacre, but less. Because after the massacre, almost all of the troops, except those standing trial, were sent out of town. All but one of the townshend duties were lifted, and people were glad to return to peace. Hancock, for one, eagerly resumed his business with the British Empire, began looking for a wife, and taking vacations. Now, we can't be blamed for thinking that something like the Boston Massacre would begin a steady march towards severing ties with the British Empire. But that is only if we read history backwards. For those living in Boston in 1770, it was a chance for peace. Hancock stepping away from politics was noticed and appreciated by others. The royal governor of Massachusetts was a man called Thomas Hutchinson. He has a sweet face here, but don't let that fool you. He was so excited because he said he reported to London that Hancock had been tied to Samuel Adams, but then suddenly all friendship between them was at an end. Hutchinson was loyal to the crown, so this is a big win for him to have Hancock, if not on his side, at least exiting politics entirely. There were no immediate threats to Hancock's liberties or finances, and he told Hutchinson, according to Hutchinson, that he was going to quit any involvement in public affairs and that he would never again be connected to Samuel Adams. The firebrand Samuel Adams, however, stayed politically busy. Of course he did. He saw threats everywhere. In 1772, he set up a committee of correspondence in Boston. this committee would communicate with the other colonies about what he called the Crown's infringements and violations. The Boston Committee was comprised of prominent men, merchants, lawyers, doctors. Many of them graduated from Harvard, and many of them were Masons. Hancock checked all of these boxes, but he declined to be a part of the Committee of Correspondence. His friend and fellow merchant and fellow moderate, Thomas Cushing, also denied himself a post in the Committee of Correspondence. Samuel Adams blamed Hancock and Cushing for not joining, not the committee or his ideas. Privately, however, Samuel and his cousin John Adams were very concerned and upset that Hancock and Cushing had not joined the committee, especially Hancock. He has such social authority and influence, and here he was sitting it out. Here's what Samuel Adams said. It's pretty harsh. For the sake of their own ease or their own safety, they preach the people into paltry ideas of moderation. Samuel Adams claimed that Cushing and Hancock did not realize, quote, the evil tendency of their conduct, end quote, when they decided not to join the committee. Avoid being ensnared in the trap set by Adams, that of a false binary. To him, Hancock was either evil by not joining the committee, or he wasn't if he joined. Rarely is life, much less revolution, that clean. People make political choices for myriad reasons, and what may be good for them one year may not be good for them another year. Hancock and Cushing were able to take wins from the British Empire. Samuel Adams remained resolute against them. Hancock had been glad to step away from any discussion or involvement in politics, that is, until 1773, when another tax is passed. This one is called the Tea Act, and it's going to tax tea imported into imported into the colonies and limit who could sell the tea. This is going to affect Hancock's business in a big way, because Hancock, for the past 3 years, had been importing and selling a load of Boston's tea. So he decided to oppose the Tea Act. Notably, he teams up with Samuel Adams, who of course opposed the Tea Act. Both of them supported the destruction of the tea, as the Boston Tea Party was known at the time, and both of them gave speeches to the crowd moments before they went down to the harbor to destroy the tea. Hancock's support for the Boston Tea Party is what gives my book title its name. After the Boston Tea Party, British soldiers were sent back to Boston. Remember, they'd been sent out in 1770, and now they're back in 1774 to police Boston. British officers kidnap a Bostonian named Samuel Dyer, and as they're holding him captive, they demand to know from him who ordered the destruction of the tea. When Dyer says, "Nobody," the officer shouts at him, "You're a damned liar. It was King Hancock and the damned Sons of Liberty." This nickname is very clever. It is an insult, to be sure. It captures Hancock's broad popularity in town, but it also is telling the colonists that the best they can do for a monarch is this guy, John Hancock, while the real king, King George III, sits on the crown in England. But then something very interesting happens. On the day the Revolutionary War began, that's April 19th, 1775, there was a battle in Lexington and later that afternoon in Concord. British troops were getting badly beaten in Concord and they needed to retreat back to Boston, 20 miles. This retreat's going to be difficult because they're going to be fired on the entire way home. Worse, they can't see where these people are firing from. because colonists were inside homes, behind walls, and trees firing. Then the retreat gets even worse. As British soldiers were retreating back to Boston with colonists attacking them, they heard that colonists cry out, "King Hancock forever." What had been an insult was appropriated as a rallying cry on the day the Revolutionary War began. Such was Hancock's appeal. It was Hancock, a moderate, who had usually declined to be a part of radical actions, who the countryside made their king. Hancock had been in Lexington just hours before the fighting broke out, but he had fled and went down to Philadelphia, where he was going to be a delegate of the Second Continental Congress. Something momentous happens to him there early on. Here's what it is. The president of the Second Continental Congress was a man named Peyton Randolph from Virginia. Randolph got called back to his home colony to legislate there. So the delegates from Congress looked to the northern colonies for their new president, and they selected John Hancock. This picture is of the Second Continental Congress, and Hancock, I put an arrow there so you could see him at the back of the room or the front of the room. And then the delegates would sit in tables with men from their own colonies. This all took place at what today we know as Independence Hall, and in the 18th century, it was the Pennsylvania State House. It was Hancock's moderation that got him the job as president, and it would be the single most important thing to happen for his political legacy. Hancock's wealth assuaged conservatives who were concerned about the radicalism from Massachusetts, but he also had revolutionary credentials, including smuggling and wine. So that satisfied some of the more radical delegates. So president he is. Him being in the middle is part of the problem, though, according to his fellow Massachusetts delegates, John and Samuel Adams. The cousins were early proponents of independence and were so upset that once again, Hancock wasn't throwing his social influence and now his role as president behind the cause of independence. By the beginning of 1776, John Adams said that Samuel Adams was speaking badly about Hancock to other people, other delegates, and had become, quote, very bitter against Hancock. They wanted Hancock to support independence. They even ousted another fellow delegate, you'll remember his name, Thomas Cushing. This was Hancock's friend who declined to sit on the Committee of Correspondence. He had been a delegate of the Second Continental Congress, but the Adams schemed to have him voted out and replaced by a radical Elbridge Gerry, a man who supported independence. For his part, Hancock had decades of proof that being a part of the British Empire was financially lucrative. He had traveled to London the decade before, where he built and developed his friendships and his business associates. He'd even considered courting the daughter of one of his business associates in London. Hancock and affluent men like him had more to lose if they declared independence, especially because they didn't know how it would all turn out. They didn't know there was no assurance of success when you took such a bold step to declare independence. The Adams cousins, in sharp contrast, had less at stake. Rupturing with Great Britain would cost them a lot less. Even if it seems like a no-brainer today, when we look back to 1776, declaring independence was an uncertain step and one that was taken with much time and deliberation. There were many delegates, not just Hancock, who urged a moderate approach. Eventually, most of them came around to independence, including Hancock. One reason that likely swayed him was something that was happening in Boston. Not political ideology, but that reoccupation of Boston by British soldiers. You remember they came back in 1774, and they had taunted and given Hancock a hard time. Then, while he was in Philadelphia, officers lived in his mansion. They destroyed parts of his mansion and terrorized the townspeople. To liberate Boston from this British occupation, the newly elected general of the Continental Army, George Washington, wanted the Continental Army to launch a frontal assault on Boston. This was a strategy that Congress had to approve. A long debate ensued, and ultimately it was decided that if necessary, Washington could attack Boston. Hancock said that, quote, "I must heartily wish it, though individually I might be the greatest sufferer." Hancock knew that if Washington attacked Boston, most of his significant property could or would assuredly be damaged. Still, he said, do it. Ultimately, though, Washington's team decides on a more defensive approach. They occupy a 100-foot tall hill across the harbor from Boston called Dorchester Heights. This picture is a little bit hard to make out, so I'm going to use the pointer here. This is the highest point of Boston where Hancock's mansion sat. Then do you kind of see these little, they look like sticks almost? Those are ship masts. That's the harbor. And then across here is Dorchester Heights. So Washington's team put cannon on the top of Dorchester Heights. And when British General William Howe saw the cannon on top of Dorchester Heights, he knew he'd been beat. Because Washington didn't now need to do a frontal assault, he just needed to start firing those cannon. Howe told Washington that he would leave Boston peacefully, not burn the town down in the process, if he was actually allowed to leave peacefully. Washington couldn't ambush him as they exited. Washington agreed. On March 17th, 1776, the last of British soldiers left Boston Harbor, never to return. Today, in Boston, it's a holiday known as Evacuation Day, which happens to fall on the same day as St. Patrick's Day. So, if you are going to be out this Sunday celebrating St. Patrick's Day, I also encourage you to raise a glass in honor of Evacuation Day. After the Redcoats left, one of Hancock's employees goes into town to survey the damage, and he reports back to Hancock that there's over 4,000 pounds worth of damage. That is a significant sum. A laborer in a year would make under 100 pounds. For example, a surplus of salt, that was one of the most valuable things that Hancock lost, that had been stolen. One of his ships was destroyed from the mast down to the lower decks. A house of his had a cannonball go through it, but miraculously, quote, otherwise not much damaged. This treatment of his property could not have made Hancock feel charitable towards the British Empire. And it was just a few months after Evacuation Day that Hancock decided to vote for independence. Independence had not been a given for the Second Continental Congress or for the man who boldly put his signature down. It's worth mentioning here that it was Hancock's name, and only Hancock's name, that authorized the Declaration of Independence. He was the president of Congress, and so his name sat at the bottom of the typeset copies here. You can see it says John Hancock, President. It sat at the bottom of the typeset copies. These were the copies that were distributed at home and abroad. The Adams cousins, for example, did not affix their name to the Declaration of Independence, so it was only Hancock who boldly proclaimed himself to be a traitor to the British Empire. That image of the Declaration of Independence that I showed you at the very beginning with the 56 signatures, that was signed a month later in August 1776, and it wasn't visible to Americans until 40 years had passed. Signing the Declaration of Independence was a turning point for Hancock because he could no longer be considered indifferent or moderate towards the fight against the British Crown. His temperament was still inclined to moderation, though. which is going to affect the early years of the new United States, which is where we'll now turn. Throughout the 1780s, men in Western Massachusetts were suffering from an enormous tax burden. They sent petitions to the legislature. They set up conventions. They were using the exact same methods, conventions, petitions, intimidation, that had been used the decade prior to declare independence. But these tactics were going nowhere. Hancock is governor at the time, and he is lax in his tax collection. This makes him popular with the masses, but the state's debt tax burden keeps building. Hancock resigns as governor in 1785, and a new governor, James Bowdoin, is elected. Bowdoin has quite a problem on his hands because the farmers in Western Massachusetts by 1786 had forcibly closed courts in Western Massachusetts. They took up arms and ensured that no judges would enter the courtrooms. They reasoned that if the courts weren't open, no one's property could be auctioned off, and no one would have to go to jail for non-payment of debt. This movement became known as Shays' Rebellion, which is a misnomer because Daniel Shays here, who was a poor Revolutionary War veteran, was drawn in reluctantly to the movement. It was a much more decentralized effort than Daniel Shays as the leader. He was, in fact, identified as the leader by the opposition. Governor James Bowdoin lacked sympathy for the protesters. He and his legislature passed several harsh and overreaching laws to try and stop the protests in the West. They suspended some civil rights. They implemented a riot act, which exonerated sheriffs, any sheriff who killed a protester during a riot. A supporter of Bowdoin's remarked, and I need to stress, this is a supporter of Bowdoin, James Warren. He says, for fear that Captain Shays should destroy the Constitution, they violated it themselves. Bowdoin also wanted to militarily suppress the rebellion. So he raised an army to do that, a private army. Samuel Adams was in favor. He thought that these rebels were insurgents and traitors, and that a hard stand should be taken against them. The man who had whipped up violence in the streets the decade earlier was now condemning it. To stop the resistance, Bowdoin, again, he looks sweet here, but raised an army of over 4,000 men, and they marched west to take on the protesters. They fired a cannon to break ranks, and ultimately, shortly after that, the rebellion petered out. Participants' punishments ranged from fines, collection of arms, and suspension of voting rights, which Bowdoin hoped would help in the next election. He would be wrong, as we'll see. The worst offenders were put on trial and sentenced to death, 18 men. The next gubernatorial election, 1787, saw James Bowdoin voted out of office and John Hancock voted back in. It was the first time in state history that Massachusetts had voted out an incumbent governor. After being elected, Hancock demonstrated how well he understood the people. He issued full pardons to the participants, except for two who had also been accused of breaking into homes. The pardons were intended to restore the public tranquility, to conciliate the affections of the people, and to establish peace in the state. This is a portrait around this time of John Hancock, and then that's his wife, Dorothy Quincy. For most of his life, Hancock was a man who avoided extremes. In 1787, his moderation benefited him, the Western rebels, and the state. He lamented the rebellion, but he was optimistic that the people, not just of Massachusetts, but those who had rebelled, would then respect this new government of Massachusetts. He knew that healing the rift, not widening it, would be good for the state. It helped that his legislature passed tax relief that year. No new taxes passed that year. Hancock and this tax reprieve were the salve the state needed. Even his critics softened a bit. That guy, James Warren, who I showed you earlier, who was a supporter of Bowdoin but had been disappointed with his conduct, was unhappy that Hancock had been elected governor, but he conceded, quote, "I do not regret the change as much as I once should." The debt relief in Massachusetts concerned powerful men from other colonies who saw the masses get what they wanted through elections and protests. These men proposed a new federal constitution, and Hancock's moderation would again be formative. Given that the U.S. Constitution still governs us today, we can look back on the debate about its ratification and think that it was the right government at the right time. But the U.S. Constitution was unpopular among many Americans, and there were very real concerns that it would not be ratified. We'll turn now to the discussions of ratification before concluding. The delegates in Massachusetts were pretty evenly split for and against the Constitution, with a slight majority opposing ratification. In some ways, this split mirrored the divisions exposed by Shays' Rebellion the year before. Those in the West usually didn't like the idea of this new constitution, this new federal overreaching constitution in their mind, and those who were disappointed in Hancock's moderate stance with the rebels supported the Constitution. Before the Massachusetts Convention began, in January 1788, 4 states had already ratified, and Connecticut ratified the day the convention began. This meant that Federalists, that's the name given to the people who supported the Constitution, were more than halfway to the required 9 states needed to ratify. So just to make it clear, you didn't need 13 states to pass a federal constitution that would govern all 13 states. The Constitutional Convention decided that you just needed 9. And now 5 states had already ratified. Check out this cartoon. As each state ratified, this cartoon would update and add a new, what they called, federal pillar. And they're hoping that Massachusetts will be next. You know that this is coming from a Federalist newspaper because look at where the pillars are coming from, the heavens. Federalists were concerned, though, that it might not pass, and they knew who to lobby: Hancock. The thing is, Massachusetts wasn't a state they could afford to lose. It was considered a swing state. If Massachusetts ratified, it would likely encourage other states to do the same. Massachusetts had strong revolutionary clout. New Hampshire was waiting to even begin their convention before Massachusetts weighed in. And Federalists James Madison and George Washington were also concerned that the decision of Massachusetts could affect that in New York and Virginia. Washington said this: "There is no question, however, but the decision of other states will have a great influence here," here being his home state of Virginia, particularly of one so respectable as Massachusetts. So Federalists go to Hancock's house. They're lobbying him pretty hard. Delegate after delegate agreed that whichever side John Hancock joined would be the victorious side because he was enormously popular. But the common belief was that Hancock was wavering between both sides and leaning more towards against ratification. So Federalists proposed 2 bargains. First, if Hancock wanted to, he could propose changes to the Constitution. This is a significant offer because to date, the Constitutional Convention had said simply, you either thumbs up it or you thumbs down it. You cannot propose any changes to this new Constitution. But Hancock and Massachusetts was important enough that they said, we've got to make some concession. Hancock was also dangled an enticing prospect in front of him. He was said that he might be named president or vice president. Everyone knew that if Virginia did end up ratifying, it would be George Washington that would be chosen president. But if not, then Hancock might be the number 2. But if not, maybe he'd even become president. Hancock decided to support the Constitution, but he wanted to make changes. Characteristically, he had chosen a middle path. He split the difference between support for the Constitution and against it. He would vote to ratify, but not in its current form. He proposed new amendments to it that focused on the power of the states. Specifically, he wanted the states to have any powers that weren't explicitly given to Congress. He also wanted state legislatures to be able to pass any taxes before Congress imposed them on all states. So here he was, the governor of his state, wanting to protect the rights of that state from what he saw to be an overreaching federal government. The vote to ratify took place a few days later. Here's Hancock, by the way, a little bit early, much earlier in his life. The vote to ratify was an intense event. Spectators arrived early and jealously guarded their seats. There was a 2-hour adjournment in the middle of the day, and no one left because they didn't want to give up their seats. One man sent a little neighborhood boy out to a shop to buy his midday meal of gingerbread and cheese because he didn't want to give up his spot. Just before the divisive vote, the governor, Hancock, made one of the most significant speeches of his life. No matter which side prevailed, he said, quote, "There can be no triumph on one side or chagrin on the other." He wanted both sides to recognize that somebody is going to be unhappy here. If the Anti-Federalists were defeated, they needed to go along with this new government. And if the Federalists succeeded, they needed to recognize that not everyone, in fact, close to half, would be disappointed with this result. All delegates, spectators, and citizens, he said, should sincerely lament the want of unanimity and strenuously endeavor to cultivate a spirit of conciliation. Throughout the American Revolution, Hancock had excelled at bringing people together. He could genuinely offer such sentiments for unity because he could see the value of both sides. Elbridge Gerry, you'll recall that was the radical who replaced Cushing in the Second Continental Congress, despised Hancock. But he even admitted that Hancock had done a good job because he, quote, took a fortunate middle course between the violence of opposing factions. To soften divisions, Hancock relied on his social influence that he'd amassed over the past 25 years. "We must all rise or fall together," Hancock said. With that, the vote began, and Massachusetts very narrowly approved the Constitution. After Hancock suggested amendments, every state that ratified thereafter also proposed amendments. Eventually, over 100 amendments were sent, compiled, and ultimately filtered to become the 10 Bill of Rights that we know today. Those Bill of Rights had not been proposed by the Constitution's framers, but by those who opposed the Constitution. In Washington, D.C. today, there is a rotunda in the National Archives housing what they call the Charters of Freedom, seminal documents to our nation's founding. The Declaration of Independence, the U.S. Constitution, and the Bill of Rights. It was moderates like Hancock who influenced their passage and thus who helped ensure the early success of the nascent United States. Thank you.
Just want to ask a couple questions and then we'll open it up to the floor here. So, of our founding fathers and those we do have those folks that in history are overshadowed by the George Washingtons and the John Adams. What inspired you to write about John Hancock?
I own a tour company in Boston, and John Hancock was from Boston, as you all know. And one of the single most frequently asked questions we get is about John Hancock from tour guests, because everyone knows his name and his signature, but they often don't realize that he's from Boston. They often don't realize that he was taking part, unlike someone, and I'm not criticizing this, but unlike someone like George Washington, Hancock was involved in that resistance and rebellion of the 1760s and early 1770s. And so most people don't know that. They think of him just for the signature. So I wanted to tell that story.
Awesome, thank you. So for as popular as John Hancock was, and we talked a little bit about this at lunch, but so as popular as he was, why do we not see him progress in his political career, especially on the national level?
So first of all, Brent, I love the way you say Hancock, because you say it with a Michigan accent, and it's wonderful. So we don't see him progress on the national level. I sort of mentioned this, that he was promised, or mostly promised, that he might become president or vice president. And ultimately, the Massachusetts Federalists who promised that turned their back on him when it came time to vote for president and vice president. He received 0 votes from the Electoral College in Massachusetts. But we tend to think of the national government today, the federal government, as the height of power, and it is. But in the 1780s, being the governor of one of these 13 sovereign states was a good gig. That meant you had a lot of power, especially in Massachusetts, which was one of the most populous states as well. So while he didn't hold national office again after he left as president of the Second Continental Congress, he certainly was one of the most powerful politically and socially in the colonies.
In your research, what was the biggest surprise to you about John Hancock's life?
What surprises me about John Hancock, and I think will surprise you all as well, is you saw some pictures of him up here, and you may have noticed that he had embroidered clothing and a powdered wig and silk stockings. This was quite unusual. He wore clothes that signified that he was an elite man and a very wealthy man. And that separated him from men who wouldn't be wearing powdered wigs and who typically had two sets of clothing. But Hancock was able to connect with people in such a very real way. We didn't really talk about it today, but the reason Hancock rises in such popularity is he gets people on his side. There's an instance where an observer said that Hancock treated every person with cheerfulness at this one party that Hancock threw. And another said that he treated every person like a brother or relative. So despite being so visibly above everyone, he was a man of the people. So what really surprised me was seeing this elite man actually become a man, if not of the people, a man for the people. Other politicians at this time were more aloof and felt less need to connect with people.
So in the book, you admittedly say that there's not a whole lot we know about Dorothy Quincy.
Yes.
Is there anything you can share with us about, we hear about the relationship between Abigail Adams and John Adams and the importance of their letters, and can you share any insights into the relationship between Dorothy and John?
Here's the big insight. Hancock liked being married to Dorothy more than Dorothy liked to be married to Hancock. Hancock was very late to get married, and but he really dives into married life. He's so happy to have someone at home who's supposed to love him and help him, but she doesn't seem fond of him at all. She doesn't like she's the only wife to be with a delegate of the Second Continental Congress in Philadelphia. And she has to help him. She cuts out some officers' commissions. She's working late into the night to help him with his presidential duties. And we don't hear much from her, but the flip is true. We hear from Hancock how much he wants to hear from her, but doesn't. He writes these letters. It's so sad. He said, "Please write me back. I'm lonely. How is Lydia?" That's their little girl who dies very young. How's our son, who also dies young? He says, "I'll write to you. Let's make a deal. You write me one letter, I'll write you one back. You write me two, I'll write you two back." And nothing. He sends her gifts. So we know she doesn't write back because he keeps asking for letters and doesn't get them. When both of their children die, it's clear that Dolly, that's Dorothy was popularly known as Dolly, found no comfort in her husband during that mourning period as well.
So a final question from me. This year, the Hauenstein Center has been following a theme of empowered citizenship. What it means to be a citizen, the rights and responsibilities that it entails, and then how can we unite and foster progress and greater understanding. Looking at John Hancock's life, what is a lesson that we can pull from his life that we can apply to now in a radical time that we're in?
I think it's sort of what we've been chatting about is understanding that people are complex and come to political decisions for any number of different reasons, but that typically a middle path is the most effective path. Even in a revolution, when the radicals got what they wanted by severing ties with the British Empire, the movement was tempered by moderates like Hancock, and it was given legitimacy by moderates like Hancock. If somebody like Hancock had not ever agreed to declare independence, it likely wouldn't have gone that way, because there was multiple moderates who wanted to slow down, send other petitions and efforts at reconciling with the crown. So what we can take from John Hancock is the legacy of knowing that even in the midst of a radical time, there is room for moderates, and moderates, those in the middle, those are who are conciliatory and able to try and look at different sides, are necessary.
Good. So at this time, we have staff members that'll be coming down into the audience. If you have a question, please raise your hand and wait for the microphone before asking a question.
Hi, I'd like to pick up where you just ended.
Yeah.
I understand what you're saying about the role for moderates. How do you amplify that so that moderates hear it or are more aware of the similarities between now and those 1760s, 1770s, and that there is a reasonable middle path?
Step one, write a book about it. Step two, come to the Hauenstein Center for Presidential Studies to tell these smart people from Michigan about it. But I think the founding fathers, the founding generation, is frequently discussed in our time period in a way that the antebellum period isn't really discussed. So this time period holds a lot of weight to citizens, lawmakers, jurists, and learning more about it and refusing to accept the simple narrative that it was good from beginning to end, that everyone benefited from beginning to end, and that everyone was unified about it. Thank you.
Unlike many of the founding fathers who were driven by concepts of individual freedom and representation, was his moderation driven more by materialism than other founding fathers?
Moderation's an interesting concept, because there's political moderation, that is what we've sort of talked about today, but there's also a moderate temperament, that is, you're just not inclined to fight with people. And I think Hancock had both. He liked to be liked. He liked to feel connected to people. And the best way to do that would be to appeal to a broad swath of people. Undoubtedly, what your question's also getting at is Hancock's financial interests. That he decides, for example, let's talk about the Tea Act. He goes in to support the Tea Act because it was going to affect his business. No doubt. I challenge the idea, though, that other people at this time, other founders or people during the founding generation, were solely motivated by individual ideology of freedom or liberty, in that can help you come to a decision, but it wouldn't be the sole reason for your decision.
In my reading, I read that Concord or Lexington kind of happened because they were looking for Hancock and Adams to arrest them.
Yeah.
Okay. I'd also heard that the first shot, nobody knew where it came from. There were some speculation that Hancock and Adams were hiding behind a stone wall, and one of those guys shot the first shot. Have you heard about that? Have you seen any proof of that?
So the first part of your question, that the rebels thought that the British soldiers were marching to Lexington to kidnap Hancock and Adams. They weren't. They were really marching towards Concord to steal munitions. But when Paul Revere sets off on his famous midnight ride, his real job is to warn Hancock and Adams that they're in danger, even though they're not. He thinks that they are. So that's the first part. The second part of the question is Hancock and Adams. This is so funny. So Revere arrives to the house where Hancock and Samuel Adams are staying, and he's banging on the door, and there are guards out front stationed to protect Hancock and Adams. And the owner of the house, Hancock's cousin, leans out the window and says, "Can you quiet down? You're making a lot of noise." And Revere shouts, "Noise? You'll have noise soon enough. The regulars are coming out." And Hancock hears this commotion outside and says to Revere, "Come in, Revere. We're not afraid of you." So on the morning that British redcoats were marching to Lexington, here is Hancock welcoming in this guy he knows, Revere, from Boston. Revere tells them, "The regulars are coming. Get out of here." But Hancock and Adams are taking their time. Hancock actually takes out his sword, thinking that he's going to take on the redcoats himself. And eventually they flee. They flee before the troops arrive to Lexington. So the idea that they fired any shots that morning is not the case. They were at that point gone for a couple of hours. Revere would have liked them to have been gone for about 4 or 5 hours, but they took their time, but they fled hours before the troops arrived.
Dr. Barbier, I really like your talk. Sometimes the New England revolutionaries are portrayed as Puritans or defined by Puritanism, not kind of like, not prone to compromise because they're convinced they're right. The Adams are often portrayed that way. John and John Quincy. Did you find, like, I know he's from Boston, but did you find John Hancock to be shaped by the Puritan heritage, or maybe he was removed from it more?
You're exactly right that John and Samuel Adams embodied the dour, sort of sober-minded Puritan spirit. And Hancock does not. And in fact, that's one of the reasons they don't like him, especially in the new nation. Hancock wears this, to them, ostentatious clothing. And he's a liberal entertainer. He spends money to entertain. And all of this leads the Adams cousins to think that the state and the United States is at risk. They think you can't be guided by these ostentatious displays. You have to be guided by disinterested virtue. Virtue was a characteristic that meant that you were seeking the broader good. they were missing the point in some ways. And Samuel Adams admits this. When Hancock is elected governor and elected governor again and again, they were one-year terms, Adams admitted that he was surprised by how much Hancock won by. Because while some leaders had this idea of what a leader should be, it's not what the people wanted. They wanted Hancock, their king.
I have two questions. I have not read your book. I will, but I've read Stacy Schiff's biography and Sam Adams. I assume you have. How well does she capture the relationship between Sam Adams and Hancock, do you think?
She does a marvelous job of showing the contentious relationship between the two. It's pretty difficult to read letters by Samuel Adams and not see how annoyed he was with Hancock most of the time. Interestingly, though, we didn't have time for it today. Much later, we're talking 1788, when the US Constitution, when there was a debate about its ratification, Adams and Hancock sort of teamed back up because Adams was an anti-federalist. He did not want the Constitution to be ratified. And later, when Hancock is elected governor, Samuel Adams serves as his lieutenant governor. And the very last years of Hancock's life, he reconnects with this man from 30 years earlier in those early days of resistance. So they had a contentious relationship, but at the very, very end, they become allies.
My second question is, in the book by Stacy Schiff, Sam Adams was very much against slavery. And even though at that time, I believe Massachusetts and New York were slaveholding states, certainly not on the scale of the South, but what was John Hancock's attitude towards slavery? Something to be temporarily tolerated? Was it repugnant to his views, or did he express any views?
Hancock's family benefited from enslaving men and women for decades. Thomas Hancock enslaved men and women, and when he died, they were bequeathed to his wife, Lydia. When Lydia died in 1776, they were bequeathed to John Hancock. We don't know why or when, so he doesn't leave his thoughts on this, but by the late 1770s, he had emancipated those that had been previously enslaved by his uncle, his aunt, and then him. In 1780, when the Massachusetts Constitution is passed, it declares that all men are created equal. And shortly after in Massachusetts, there are two suits filed by enslaved peoples, Mum Bet and Quock Walker, where they're suing for their freedom, and they win. And by 1790, the Massachusetts census says that there are no enslaved people in the state. Hancock, as governor during this time, so again, we don't hear his personal thoughts, but he was taking steps to weaken the institution of slavery. And then in 1792, something very interesting happens. A newspaper reports that Hancock, in the name of liberty and equality, hosted Black women and men in his home for a party. Critics jumped on this, and they derisively called this event an equality ball. There's a political cartoon that's in the book that shows Black women and men dressed in fine clothing and dancing. And that is the supposed humor of the cartoon, to see that the Black man in the front of the cartoon is shaking Hancock's hand and thanking him for being a man who supported Black women and men. This doesn't make, hosting an equality ball doesn't make Black women and men equal in Boston, of course, nor does it ease the legacy of slavery in Hancock's own home. But it shows that Hancock had changed his mind. It's difficult to imagine any politician hosting Black women and men in their home at this time, but especially in the name of liberty and equality.
After the Revolution, what was Hancock's attitude toward the Loyalists? And did you make any attempt to reconcile these people to the Patriots? A lot of them had left the area. Did he attempt to bring them back? What was his participation there?
That's a really great question. Loyalists, Massachusetts takes a pretty hard stand against loyalists, and that their property can be confiscated. And I don't find any traces of where Hancock was saying we shouldn't do that. But certainly there were, Hancock knew loyalists. Typically, wealthy individuals sided with loyalists. Not all, of course, Hancock's one of them. But he certainly knew other men in Boston who chose the wrong side. And that is the side that they can choose whatever side they want. But the side that didn't end up victorious in this struggle. But we don't hear from him directly, but that's a wonderful question. And these are some of the gaps sometimes as a historian where you want him to say something about why he's doing what he's doing or what he's thinking. This is similar to so many of the questions you all have asked. But we just don't hear from him about it.
How many times was he elected governor?
So he was elected to 11 one-year terms. So he was elected in 1780 and he resigned in the middle of his term in 1785. He was very ill at this time. Through the last 10 years of his life, he had mobility issues and he sometimes couldn't hold a quill in his hand. So he resigned in 1785. And then after Shays' Rebellion, he was elected in 1787, and then those one-year terms until he dies in office in 1793. He dies at the age of 56, which is incredibly young at this time. For example, Samuel Adams makes it into his 80s. John Adams makes it to 90. So 56 is very young to die. I also just want to say, to build on that he was elected every year overwhelmingly. He won 80 to 90% of the state vote, overwhelmingly. But what's interesting is after Shays' Rebellion, his support in Boston, his hometown and the largest population center, declines. Because Boston was where the moneyed interest was, and they were upset at him for siding with the farmers in Shays' Rebellion. So he remains popular, still winning by big margins, but his popularity in Boston had declined after Shays' Rebellion.
It's easier to understand who someone is with like a modern day comparison.
Oh, hi.
So I was wondering, who do you think would be a modern day comparison? Because you said he was more moderate to the political parties, but he was also able to gain the public attention and moderate of the people. So who would you say has the personality trait, I guess, of John Hancock today?
That is a beautiful question, and I'm not going to answer it. But what I'll say is it's a really beautiful question, and I really thank you for it. Hancock is so unique, doesn't mean he doesn't have parallels, but he was so ostentatious. He was so beloved, but also sought that middle path. And that's why he could seek the middle path, was because he was so popular. That otherwise, people wouldn't have cared if he was a moderate. That's the thing. A lot of times, moderates get ignored, dismissed, maligned, because they don't have the popularity to be paid attention to, as you initially asked as well. So in the time period, it's easy to dismiss moderates, and it's easy now to dismiss them. But Hancock had that unique blend. I really do appreciate the question, though. I appreciate all these questions. You guys are fantastic.
So, seeing as John Hancock named his own daughter after his aunt, Lydia,
yes.
What role did Lydia, his aunt, play in his life?
Fabulous. Let me also tell you a little bit of kid trivia here. John Hancock's son was given the middle names of George Washington. So he was John George Washington Hancock. So Lydia, his Aunt Lydia, this is one of those where, again, we don't hear from Lydia. We don't have many letters from her. But Hancock didn't have a close relationship to his mother. After his dad died at age 7, we don't see much contact, at least that survives, between he and his mother. So Lydia had really taken on that role. There's some accounts, not from Lydia herself, but from others, who said that Lydia was very involved in trying to get Hancock married to Dorothy Quincy. There's a story where Lydia and Dorothy Quincy were staying at Thaddeus Burr's house in Connecticut, and he was cousin, I believe, to Aaron Burr, that Aaron Burr. And Aaron Burr had a reputation for being a bit of a rake, and so Lydia stopped allowing Aaron Burr and Dorothy Quincy to be in the same room without a chaperone because she was concerned that Dorothy Quincy might like Aaron Burr. So Lydia, we have just sort of glimpses of her here and there, but we don't know much. And then she died in 1776 in Connecticut while Hancock was in Philadelphia. So that would be devastating in its own way too, to not be there when his sort of last parental figure, last guardian died.
We have time for one more question back in the corner here.
Did John Hancock hold grudges against the Federalists that wronged him, that said that he'd maybe get a position as like the vice president? And, like,
Did he do what?
Did he hold grudges toward those people?
Hold grudges. He continued, not necessarily hold grudges, but he continued to advocate even after voting to ratify for the Constitution. Some of the last speeches of his life he gave, sometimes he couldn't even give them himself. He had to have others read it, so weak was he. But continued to advocate for the rights of states. So it wasn't as if he, by ratifying the Constitution, lost that concern for the sovereignty of what he called at certain times separate republics, meaning the separate states. But we don't know that he held grudges. John Adams returns home at one time and Hancock throws him this party. So Hancock also similarly wanted to fet George Washington, these people who got the positions that he would have wanted. If that was the last question, can I just say, I really thank you all so much for coming tonight, for your thoughtful questions. I'm so honored to be here. So I really thank you guys.
Well, Brooke, thank you for sharing some insights into such an interesting person, one of our, again, overshadowed founding fathers. I invite everybody to please join us in the X Hall for desserts and conversations about tonight's presentation. Also, copies of King Hancock will be available for sale, and Brooke will be there to sign your copy. And then I hope everybody is willing or able to join us on April 18th at 6 p.m. right here in Loosemore for our next event, Reflections on Patriotism, where we'll welcome Yale professor Stephen B. Smith, former USA Today columnist Cal Thomas, and historian and novelist Elizabeth Cobbs to talk about patriotism. Again, thank you for coming this evening, and enjoy the rest of your evening and safe travels home.
Thank you.